It's 1:30. My name is Pascal Brangetto. I'm the French national representative at the NATO CCD COE. I'm very pleased to welcome you here at this session on this very hot topic that is surveillance. We have three distinguished speakers this afternoon that are going to help us grasp all the implications of this debate today. I mean, it's being on the news with the debate on FISA in the United States, debate in France also with this law on surveillance. And the format of this session will be the following. We'll have each of our presenters giving a presentation of 15-20 minutes, and then we'll have a panel debate, and we'll open questions to the floor. So without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker. This is Professor Lee BYGRAVE. Professor BYGRAVE is a teacher of private law at the University of Oslo, but he is also the director of the Norwegian Research Center for Computers and Law. And he will give us this European perspective on this very, very hot topic. Professor BYGRAVE, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Pascal. Good afternoon, everyone. The structure of my talk will be as follows. I'm going to look firstly a little bit at the basic architecture of cyberspace, and in particular ask the question, to what extent to what extent does that architecture promote privacy and security interests? To what extent does it detract from those interests? And then I want to turn to Europe's role in promoting privacy and security within that cyberspace architecture. Thank you. Turning first to cyberspace architecture. The life and the logic of the internet is not fencing, but flows. So it's not the compartmentalization of information, but it's its dissemination. And one of the overarching effects of the internet has been to enhance greatly what I've called electronic interpenetration. By that I mean the basic interpenetration of previously separate spheres of activity. And the internet has done this by enabling greater use and reuse of data across traditional organizational boundaries and across other contextual borders. And this trend is being accelerated through a variety of ever more sophisticated software applications, persistent third-party cookies, metadata tagging, search engines, and the like. Nonetheless, there are plenty of digital fences that have been constructed or are in the process of being constructed, either in the interest of privacy, in the interest of security, or in the interest of profit, sometimes for all three or two, to name some of the most salient interests at stake. And there are certain features of the basic internet architecture that are inherently privacy-friendly. I think a very good example is the lack of sophisticated identification capabilities in the TCP/IP protocol suite, that is the Transmission Control Protocol Internet Protocol suite. And that's a characteristic that reflects the so-called end-to-end principle that is central to the internet's current design. The end-to-end principle posits that the medium, that is the pipelines for data transmission, they are to be kept simple. The intelligence, as it were, that is to be built in at the network endpoints. Yet, if we consider the digital fences as a whole, they tend to be porous. They all tend to leak to varying degrees. And if we consider the basic raison d'etre of the internet, then that creates obvious challenges, obvious stress points, particularly for law dealing with protection of personal data and for law dealing with information security more generally. And this means, at the very least, that lawmakers have their work cut out if they are meaningfully to safeguard privacy interests or security interests in the internet environment. And when it comes to privacy protection, I'd say the challenge here is more acute for Europeans than for, say, Americans, because the existing laws for privacy and data protection here in Europe are generally more stringent, at least on paper, than the equivalent rules are in the USA. So there is a greater collision between the ideals of privacy and data protection law on the one side and the mechanics and raison d'etre of the internet on the other. When you look at US law on point, it's relatively lax, that is at least relative to Europe, particularly with respect to the private sector. There is, for example, little, if any, real imposition of the principles of proportionality or purpose limitation, that is, the principles that say that all processing of personal data should be proportionate to the ends pursued, and that when you collect data, you collect it for certain purposes, and you don't use the data later for other purposes that are incompatible with the primary purposes, absent consent or legal authority. You don't find those principles at all salient in US law. Also, US law permits a greater degree of contractual override of privacy interests. Witness the terms of service of Facebook, Google, and many of the other US-based giants of the internet economy. At the same time, US law and US practices provide many of the default data collection settings in the online world. They do so both overtly and, as the Snowden Revelations highlighted, covertly. Indeed, the Snowden Revelations confirmed not just the porous nature of digital fences, but that the data collection channels of covert surveillance were more extensive and more US-centric than the general public had surmised. In cyberspace, you can say all roads lead to America, the internet's motherland. Now, as we all know, the revelations of Edward Snowden led to surprise and even outrage, along with a great deal of political grandstanding, not least here in Europe. They helped to catalyse a flurry of demands for greater security and privacy in cyberspace, ranging from email services to the configurations of the internet's backbone and to the use of particular top-level domains in the domain name system. The outrage over the revelations was particularly marked shortly after the 6th of June 2013, which some people now call Prism Day. They helped spark new life into the EU data protection reform process, a process that was threatening to stall completely under the weight of several thousand suggested amendments to the original proposal by the European Commission for a general data protection regulation, a proposal launched back in January 2012. And these were amendments that were the result of intensive lobbying efforts from a multitude of concerned stakeholders. The Snowden Revelations also deepened doubts over the legitimacy of the so-called Safe Harbour Agreement, an agreement that allows personal data to flow from EU and European Economic Area countries to US organisations that voluntarily agree to abide by the agreement. And the Snowden Revelations led to calls for greater use of local cloud computing services. More generally, I think, they also led to a re-emergence of widespread concerns over so-called information sovereignty, particularly in Europe, particularly in Germany, here in Europe, and outside Europe, I'd point to Brazil. While I think these concerns over information sovereignty are still breathing at the least, I think much of the outrage and the surprise over the Snowden Revelations has dissipated. The revelations have had an ephemeral effect on the interest of the general public in privacy and security matters, as demonstrated in a recent study published in the latest issue of Communications of the Association for Computing Machinery, ACM. And the Snowden Revelations, I think, aren't going to give much help to the efforts of European legislators to reform the EU data protection framework and to introduce other legal measures to promote cybersecurity. The data protection reform process again shows signs of stagnation. The whole process is now dragged on for such a long time that we are increasingly left feeling as though we are characters in Samuel Beckett's play Waiting for Godot. I think particularly problematic is the long overdue enactment by the EU of detailed rules on data protection for the area of freedom, security and justice, the so-called AFSJ sector of EU activity. Here we still have rather generally formulated baseline standards elaborated by the Council of Europe rather than the EU, coming through in Convention 108 and in case law from the European Court of Human Rights pursuant to Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights. But the EU hasn't really got its act together yet when it comes to a comprehensive, systematic data protection framework for the activities of the policing and justice sector. All up, though, if you look at the proposals of both the EU Commission and the European Parliament for a general data protection regulation and for a new directive on data protection in the policing and justice area, you do see, nonetheless, an admirable determination to ensure that privacy is not lost in cyberspace. And I think much of the non-European world can be expected to copy, or at least be inspired, by whatever new regulatory model the EU comes up with in this field. The EU has traditionally led the way in this area, with the majority of non-European countries that have enacted data protection standards or data protection legislation having adopted EU-style rules. And in this particular area, the USA, interestingly enough, is an increasingly solitary outlier. Turning to information security more specifically, there's also much that needs to be done here in Europe. I have only time to name a few points of concern. My first relates to legal requirements for prevention of cybercrime, particularly the Cybercrime Convention enacted back in 2001, the so-called Budapest Convention, to which the USA is a ratifying party. Now, the influence and legitimacy of that convention have been weakened by persisting question marks over its conformity with basic human rights and with basic international law principles. It's also, its global traction has also been rather limited. While it does constitute a significant point of departure for legal developments outside Europe, for example in the USA and Australia, we still have only a rather small number of states that have ratified the convention. So the convention as yet hardly qualifies as a global agreement. Within the EU, we have also a proposal for a new directive on network and information security. It's a good directive on its face. My main concern, however, is its coverage. We see that it doesn't cover software developers or computer hardware manufacturers, and the European Parliament has further reduced its scope by excluding so-called information society service providers, search engines, cloud computing services, from the requirements of Article 14 of that directive, which requires, amongst other things, agencies along with designated market operators to take appropriate security measures for their networks and information systems. My third and final point of concern relates to encryption. Now, many, if not most, Western states have fairly liberal policies when it comes to use of cryptography. That is, the employment of strong encryption by private persons and enterprises has been generally viewed in a positive light. Western governments have generally refrained from introducing schemes for mandatory key escrow for policing purposes, And the legal frameworks for use of cryptography have been generally light touch. We see, however, starting somewhat with the events of 9/11, but particularly in recent years, increasing pressure to facilitate police access to unencrypted or decrypted data sent over the internet. And I do believe that in the next few years, there will be a new battle over encryption standards. And the balance to be struck in that battle, I think that needs to be squarely addressed now and squarely addressed particularly by the European Union. To sum up, then, there is much to be done for enhancing privacy and security in cyberspace, both here in Europe and elsewhere. To come to the question that is in the title of my presentation, what role for Europe? I think Europe has a rather special role in that it has, at least formally, a very strong commitment to civil liberties and particularly to data protection. Indeed, it's the only jurisdiction or set of jurisdictions in the world which has raised a right to data protection up amongst the family of fundamental human rights. Look at Article 8 of the European Charter on Human Rights from 2000. And that's a commitment that cannot easily be ditched. It's part of Europe's constitutional structure. And the Court of Justice of the European Union has shown increasing willingness to ensure that, for example, policing interests do not run roughshod over data protection and privacy interests. And it has upheld the latter interests through a very stringent assessment of the proportionality of policing measures. Look, for example, at the way it torpedoed the 2006 Data Retention Directive. So I think Europe's special role, in answer to the question in my title of my talk, is that it needs to ensure ongoing commitment to civil liberties at the same time as it moves forward on security. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lee, for this insightful presentation.